Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies. I'm your host, Nishant Rajeev, a research analyst at the Institute of South Asian Studies. Although the early use of unmanned aerial vehicle technology on the battlefield can be traced back to the 1980s, it is only in the 2010s that they found their way into the headlines. In recent years, drones have been brought under the spotlight due to their expanding use on the battlefield. For instance, Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was killed in a drone strike ordered by President Donald Trump in early 2020. Later, in October that same year, Azerbaijan extensively deployed Turkish drones to defeat Armenia in the Nagorno Karabakh conflict. In keeping with these recent trends, the Indian military has also sought to acquire advanced drones to support its military operations. Joining me today to discuss the Indian military's quest to adopt and deploy drones is Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow at ISAS NUS. India last year approved of a deal to procure 30 armed drones from the US for a cost of nearly $3 billion. But this is just the latest development in the Indian military's use of drones. India has operated drones for nearly 2 decades now. So, Yogesh, my first question to you would be what has driven India's interest in drones, and where does India's efforts to deploy, acquire, and employ drone technology stand today?
Thanks, Nishant. Thanks for having me on South Asia Chart, you know, which is our flagship podcast event at ISAS. And thanks for talking to me on this very interesting and, developing subject in a sense. Uh, so, what has driven India's interest? I think, as you rightly mentioned, it's first of all, the technological evolution. Every military, every armed forces want to keep abreast with technological evolution. If we remember India's first indigenous drone program, in a sense, or unmanned, uh, you know, aircraft systems, as they say, the Rustam, was initially the process started in 1980s. But the indigenous efforts didn't take us very far. India first deployed drones in Kashmir in early 1990s, Israeli drones, for counterinsurgency, for surveillance, and counterterrorism operations. But it first bought en masse um, unmanned systems only in late 1990s, particularly the Israeli Heron 1 and the Searcher UAVs in late 1990s. Uh, and these were again deployed mostly for surveillance reconnaissance, operations in a sense. Uh, but over a period of time, you also see that the employment of drones, uh, as per their military utility, has also changed. For a long period of time, unmanned aerial vehicles were basically employed for surveillance and reconnaissance. But as you see, starting from the American war on terror in Afghanistan, then their deployment in Iraq, and to many other places, as you mentioned, the latest revolution in a sense, or at least the practical, display of what drones can do during the Azerbaijan Armenian conflict. The military utility has changed in a sense from being force multipliers in terms of gathering intelligence, providing targets, more of in a sense more in support role, to actually becoming part and parcel of delivering violence in a sense, which militaries are entitled to do or are supposed to do. And that has led to, combat systems, unmanned combat systems. So if you see the trajectory of how UAVs have been employed in military tactics and strategy, you also see that change happening in the Indian context. So Indians have gone from basically acquiring uh, ISR drones like searchers, like herons, or indigenous ones like Rustams, Nishants, Netras, Panchis. to more combat drones. Now India is, as you mentioned in your opening statement, India has signed a deal of the Reaper, combat drones for that matter. India has also acquired the Harpies and the Harrops. The Harpies are anti-radar combat UAVs, which basically target radar stations, to provide some to context to establish air supremacy. The Harpies are what we call loitering munitions, which loiter in the battlefield and then attack a particular target. So these have been acquired from Israel. So India is moving from particularly using drones to, in terms of its military utility in ISR, to more towards its functionality in combat operations. So that's a trend which is easily visible. The second important thing which I would like to mention is that there's a lot of effort today in a sense of developing an indigenous ecosystem. Maybe we'll touch upon it later, but there's a lot of emphasis. At least the projects are underway, like the Ghatak drone, which the DRDO is developing, which is India's first stealth unmanned aerial vehicle. Similarly, the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited is doing something called CATS, which is combined armed teaming, aircraft teaming systems, which will basically team up with Indian fighter aircrafts like Tejas and Jaguars to provide force multiplying effect in the air, and swarm enemy targets in a sense. And then there are a number of private institutions, private industry, which is now helping the Indian Armed Forces to develop their unmanned aerial vehicle capability. In January 2021, there was the first major deal with a startup called Idea Forge, which is going to provide, the Switch micro UAVs to the Indian Army for a $20 million deal, which was the first, uh, first participation by a private industry, Indian startup. So I think the landscape is changing not only in terms of Indian military is adjusting to new functionalities, but also, in a sense of where these systems are going to come from. But having said that, given the ecosystem right now, it will take a lot of time for India to kind of develop that ecosystem. So, primarily, if you look at the military, most of these UAVs would be imported. India is the third largest importer of military UAVs in the world. Uh, so, that will continue for the time being. Uh, but having said that, one should also understand that the technological landscape has also changed in a sense that it's easy to produce these systems today. And given the advances in artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the coming of the 5G, the applications of drones are much larger. Those are basically expanding into domains which are far beyond the military. So, for example, agriculture, it's being used actively in India for pest control, for soil monitoring, for soil erosion. Uh, if you remember, in last 2 years, they have been deployed to fight locust swarms. So that is one. They are being employed for forestry and wildlife, tiger preservation. Uh, they are fundamental to changing demands for mobility mapping and monitoring, whether it is ecological auditing, town planning. For example, there is a scheme called Samitwa, where drones are basically being used to map rural property, and villagers can actually download their land holdings through mobile once the drones have done their job of mapping these rural properties. They are employed for disaster management. India deployed searchers and herons during the 2004 tsunami crisis, as well as the same drones were deployed during the Kedarnath crisis, the Kedarnath floods in 2013. So the applications are are huge. They are being deployed for law and order. So during the COVID pandemic, the Delhi police deployed drones to see that the containment zones are maintained. That the people are following rules and guidelines which were given for containing the COVID pandemic. The India's paramilitary forces have used drones uh, for election security, so to say, particularly in Maoist zones for that matter. So they have a range of applications, and it has gone beyond the military, so to say. And in some sense, if one needs to understand, one needs to put it in a bigger context, because there's a lot of dynamic interaction between the civilian applications and the military applications. And until and unless you develop that ecosystem where the same technologies can be used for both, you will not be able to harness the 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 many possibilities provided by the commercial usage of these technologies by the private players who are interested both by business, commerce, and profits, as well as use them for your own national security purposes. So I think the larger factor over here is to see this ecosystem developing. And you see that happening, you actually see the realization of this in India's policy, or regulatory policy on drones. So by if you look at the first guidelines in 2014, there was no commercial activity which was allowed under the rules by the Director General of Civil Aviation. By 2018, new guidelines kind of allowed limited commercial activity. And by 2021, India was at the forefront of liberalization of drone technologies and their usage. That also kind of comports with the projected markets of unmanned aerial vehicles, aircraft systems, particularly in India. Some project that by 2026 it's gonna be a $2 billion markets. FICCI, the Indian Industry Chamber of Commerce, in a sense, projects a $30 billion drone market. And the Indian government is also gung ho in making India a drone hub in the world. So I think there are a number of factors which are coming together to kind of help us understand why the drones have become so vital, not only for the Indian military, but also also for civilian applications, but also the business climate in the country.
Well, thank you for that very comprehensive overview. And there's definitely a lot to unpack there. But there's one point I want to touch upon, which you said that you mentioned that the landscape is changing due to the technological developments. And I think the landscape not only in India is changing, but the landscape around India and its adversaries are also changing. So China has been operating a pretty diverse drone fleet, and Pakistan has been acquiring drones from China and Turkey as well. And you see non-state actors also using drones quite a bit. The Houthi rebels have used it in their conflicts with Saudi Arabia. So the question I want to pose to you here is that what is the drone threat that India faces today from both its conventional and unconventional adversaries, and how will this sort of impact the balance of military power if it does going forward?
I think that's a central question for for thinking about drones in your military strategy, you have to first of all understand the threats. Before you can actually think about how where drones fit in your military strategy. I think for a long period of time, drones were largely force multipliers in a sense that they provided intelligence, they provided surveillance, they provided, you know, easy ways to do reconnaissance, particularly uh, in terrains where Indian army is presently deployed, which is largely hilly, mountainous, rugged, so to say. So that was the primary function, and if that is the function, that was largely defensive in nature. One should also understand, that any kind of military technology has to, uh, you know in a sense, uh, does provide both offensive and defensive advantages. Ultimately, it is your military objectives which would define how those technologies will be used. And India's approach has been largely status quoist. So if you're defending, if you're largely defending, if you're largely in a defensive mode, then probably the maxim the best use of drones had been in basically developing your ISR capabilities, in movement of troops, whether even whether military CBMs are being observed or not, in India China case particularly for that matter. uh, you know so uh, so so that was largely the role of the drones for quite some time. But more and more you see in the Indian strategic community, particularly, the use of drones by the US in its war on terror, particularly targeting terrorist, you know uh, targets in both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as the recent Azerbaijan Armenian conflict. There is a sense that drones can be used to deliver force and violence. Now, I am a little skeptical about it in a sense that, first of all, we need to understand that more if we taking the cues from the U.S. actions uh, in in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or even in the Middle East. You're talking about uncontested airspaces. Okay. Now, in uncontested airspaces, it's very easy to use drones, to deliver, violence in a sense. But it's not so in contested airspaces. So the efficacy of drones in contested airspaces is something which is, which hasn't been proved yet. So that is one thing. The other thing is basically that, uh, in a sense, many have argued that you can use drones in a sense to reduce uh, your human loss. Okay, but then again, the efficacy of drones in destroying a target, particularly in contested airspaces, and whether they are just a signal of escalation. Those are two very different things. I still think that standoff capabilities are much more important. Now, coming to what can happen, and particularly with Pakistan and China, both are using drones, but we haven't seen that capability where drones can basically inundate Indian defenses. There is definitely the threat of swarms, of drone swarms, and all of that. But in the conventional battlefield, it is not Azerbaijan Armenian example, because that's a very lopsided example in a sense, particularly if you look at the Armenian air defenses, which are Cold War, which were Cold War vintage in a sense. So there was no contest there, so to say. uh, you know so uh, uh, so in some sense, I still think that we haven't reached a stage where drones could change the balance of military power, and largely because, at the end of the day, what is military power for? If you're looking at major changes in terms of territory, that is not going to happen in South Asia, particularly because nuclear weapons, in some sense, have frozen borders. There cannot be any large exchange of territory by use of force. That is something which doesn't really apply in the South Asian case, whether it is India, China, or India, Pakistan. So what is left to is gray zone operations, where drones can be used to swarm a particular target, maybe force multiply force may be used to target radar systems and other such defensive measures, particularly before an intrusive attack and all that. But that would open a can of escalation which would be very, very difficult to contain. So I'm not sure whether how revolutionary drones would be in the conventional battlefield in the South Asian case, because it's still large. I would say the standoff capabilities like cruise missiles, for that matter, or ballistic missiles, have far more functionality compared to drones. So I would still see drones in a very as an advantage for defense rather than an advantage for offense. Uh, Given the current trajectory of the of of the technology, but even hypersonic missiles, in some sense, are unmanned aircrafts. So so we are talking about what type you're talking about then becomes central to this question. Where those standoff capabilities can be used to inundate enemy's defenses, and give a shock therapy, so to say. But then, whether hypersonic missiles are considered to be drones, people might be divided on that. So I think that is something which we need to kind of keep in mind. Uh, I think there's much more concern on sub-conventional level, and you see that happening on India Pakistan border particularly. And we saw a major incident in the Jammu air base in 2021, where armed drones were used to drop explosives on kamikaze style on an air force base in India's Jammu province. Now that is an issue, and that is in some sense continuation of drone activities across the border, which are used to smuggle drugs, to smuggle guns, to smuggle explosives, to help uh, terrorist elements, not only in Jammu and Kashmir but also in Punjab, for that matter. So how do you deal with that? And the particular problem basically is that there are no return addresses, in a sense. Even if you can trace the origins of these drones and all that, it's very difficult to pinpoint, and particularly against non-state actors, which an adversary like Pakistan has never owned up to. So if you don't own up human elements, how difficult it is to own up to drones, for that matter. So that's a major issue, and therefore anti-drone capabilities would become extremely important, for the Indian military. And that's what you see, a lot of police forces, the border security force, the Indian military is developing anti drone capabilities, whether it is lasers, whether it is jamming capabilities, or whether it is kinetic action against these drones. The Indian Navy has actually acquired some of the smash rifles, which can actually target drones, so to say. But targeting drones is also extremely difficult, because they have small radar intersection, and their size and speed basically militates against identification and targeting. So I think at the subconventional level, India has a lot a lot to think about, because at the end of the day, these, in some sense, these are cheap technologies, particularly the way drones are being built today. And if they are successful in pin pricking, the Indian forces in particularly in insurgency hit areas like Jammu and Kashmir, and not insurgency hit area right now, but has a potential in a sense in Punjab, then you have really an issue at hand. uh, Also because your state of mind regarding insurgencies and how they are conducted needs to be changed, because most of your counterinsurgency strategy is against human elements. So you create a wall, you create a barbed wire, you have all kinds of CCTV coverage, ISR capabilities to track movement of insurgents. But not so much against drones, so to say. So there's a lot of change which needs to be inculcated, not only in terms of strategy tactics, but also in terms of training, of your human resources, how to tackle these illicit activities across the border. So I think at the subconventional level, there's a lot more uh, to be worried about than at the conventional level, particularly at the level of offensive conventional capabilities.
I want to talk about a little bit about that offensive conventional capabilities, because what we've seen, I think, under the Modi administration has been a willingness to use force against in retaliation to terrorist attacks. And it's kind of calling the nuclear bluff, because there's a assumption that, if we use conventional force, it'll lead to escalation. And we saw with the Balakot attacks that that's not always the case. So, and drones themselves have certain inherent advantage. One is that they're pilotless, so it reduces certain political costs and allows you to take greater risks. So in terms of that, there's an argument that says it can affect stability of certain conflict zones. So just your perspective on this, like how it impacts stability in South Asia, especially in light of this new thinking in the Indian administration.
There's definitely a shift when it comes to India's penchant to use force. And you have seen that particularly in the last 10 years. Now, the argument regarding drones is basically that it allows decision makers to use force on the cheap. Because at the end of the day, the retaliation would only be against the unmanned aerial vehicle. It would be shot down, but because it would be pilotless, to be in layman's terms, there are little costs associated with it, both in terms of human costs, but also reputational costs. Downing a MiG, as we saw during the Balakot strike, comes with huge reputational costs, and the ensuing crisis, which resulted with the capture of the Indian fighter pilot. That kind of binds decision makers into a vicious cycle of escalation. Okay, that might not be true with drones, because as you rightly said, there's no human cost, and therefore there are less reputational costs. uh, you know uh, so that is true, to a certain extent. So it might increase the penchant for the use of force. Now there are two counterpoints to it. First of all is, what military objectives can you achieve by deploying drones? Can you particularly in a contested airspace? So given the advantages, there are also severe disadvantages. Because if you want to achieve a military objective, you might not be able to do that, because the platform itself is not capable enough to deliver that military objective to you. So that is one. The second is basically about contested airspaces. It's very difficult for drones, unless you're talking about cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles as unmanned aerial vehicles. It's easy to bring them down. what the maximum speed at drones work, basically. So if your enemy has good air defense systems, the effectiveness of drones in delivering in basically carrying out use of force is limited. uh, but I would say that they serve a different purpose in terms of signaling. you know uh, Particularly when it comes to use of force is not always employed for achieving military objectives. Sometimes a military objective itself is just signaling intent and willingness to punish. Okay. And in that sense, if the objective is to signal your willingness and intent to use force, until and unless the adversary ceases its hostile activity. If it is signaling in the larger ladder of escalation, then it does its job pretty effectively and cheaply. So one can say that the use of drones might help in the signaling objectives in terms of telling the adversary that we will not take your subconventional uh, you know tactics hands down, but we will actually contest it. And it will depend upon your reactions how this escalation ladder will unfold. So I think use of drones in that sense is important for signaling, your intent and willingness uh, when it comes to use of force. But the effectiveness of it, I am not very sure.
Okay, I'd like to change tracks a little now because we've talked a lot about military drones, and I want to talk about the civilian applications. Recently, the Indian government made various budgetary allocations, and they're trying to build this drone ecosystem. But and they've also pursued international partnerships with, especially with Israel. So can you go a little bit more into the details of like the civilian application of drones and what, because we've seen the Indian government try to promote, especially in the past with public sector enterprises, try to promote the use of technology, domestically produced technologies. So can you talk about a little bit about the civilian applications, and then where is the drone program in India headed, both in terms of like the public sector enterprises, but also now, as you mentioned earlier, which is the private sector and the startups that are coming into play.
Right. I think the civilian applications is the most interesting part of it. Particularly if you see the kind of initiatives which have taken place in last 2 years or so. So there is major Indian startups which are developing drones for applications in agriculture. Particularly in terms of, and IFCO, one of the major suppliers of fertilizers, has used drones, for pesticide control as well as providing fertilizers to crops. There's applications of drones in crop mapping, in soil erosion, and there are a lot of startups in India who are actually looking at these. uh, the other is, just mapping and inspections. So, National Thermal Power Corporation of India has used drones to inspect its sites, provide security as well as checking pipelines, oil and gas pipelines for leakages, so to say. Uh, you know, uh, there are a number of other initiatives which came up during the COVID pandemic where, new startups. I'm forgetting the name right now, but some of these startups have collaborated with government in Telangana, the Maharashtra government, the Goa government, to deliver, COVID vaccines, as well as get test samples, from rural areas, so to say. There is a one Indian startup which is trying to build a heavy lift, a drone which can carry up to 150 kgs of weight, which, when implemented, would bring a logistical revolution in India. Particularly because, you know, uh, loads which take up to 2 to 3 days can be delivered in a matter of 5 to 6 hours, so to say. And I mentioned about disaster, management. I mentioned their role in geospatial mapping, which is now a big area which is developing in India, particularly with the liberalization of geospatial mapping in India in the last 2 years. So the number of civilian applications are humongous, and that's why you see that uh, you know the startup ecosystem has is thriving when it comes to unmanned aerial vehicles. There are 150 startups in India, particularly in Bangalore, which are trying to get a share of what could be a very big market. But most importantly, I would say that the regulations have opened up. As I said, in 2015 there was no commercial activity allowed. In 2018 we liberalized a bit, but in 2021 we are one of the most liberalized economies when it comes to drone operations. That is one part of it, liberalizing the market, so that it provides incentives for private players to kind of jump in with all kind of applications. And with the introduction of 5G, it would also revolutionize beyond the visual applications, particularly of drones. That is one thing. The second thing is basically, uh, you know, uh, the government is also trying to build this ecosystem largely by providing incentives to domestic players. So if you see the 2022 budget, no foreign companies are allowed no imports on drones and drone products are allowed in India until and unless they are for R&D, defense, or for other state enterprises like ISRO, for so to say. So that is basically providing negative sanctions and creating a market incentive. The third, I think, is also the PLI, the production linked incentives, which last year the government of India sanctioned something like 120 crores for the private manufacturers to build drones, and providing tax breaks to these private players. So, when it comes to regulation, you're liberalizing. When it comes to imports, you're restricting imports. But also you're also providing incentives to private players. And lastly, you're doing a lot of public private interface. So the idea Forge, to give an example, which won the contract for the Switch UAVs with the Indian Army, is a startup by Asians, so to say. But the Indian Army has given that contract to a startup in India, which tells you a lot about the change in attitude of the Indian military. Because the Indian military was always considered to be looking towards foreign vendors when it came to their military equipment. So there's a number of startups also working with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited and DRDO to develop new drone systems. So you see a lot of public private interface. So I think those four are the major changes which have occurred in India's drone landscape, and they promise. We don't know how things will pan out in a sense, but they are a promising start. And some of the results are already evident in a say. But look, at the end of the day, what is most important is that you develop the entire ecosystem. Fundamental to some of these technologies is microelectronics, semiconductors. So it's heartening news that a number of startups have applied for licenses with the government to build semiconductors. Foxconn is building a facility in India to build semiconductors. And electronics have been a major major sector where the Indian government in last 7 8 years has given a lot of emphasis on building the electronics infrastructure in India. So I think it's not just one sector which would lead. So in a sense that drones are not manufactured in isolation compared to the larger industrial and scientific and R&D ecosystem in India. So if you're making progress on 5G, if you're making progress on semiconductors, if you're making progress on applications of AI, if you're making progress on sensors for that matter, across these sectors in industry, then it provides greater interface, greater interaction, greater opportunities for manufacturers of unmanned aerial vehicles in the country, because at the end of the day, a product is basically consists of many subsystems. So until unless you can produce those subsystems, at the end of the day, you're just trying to assemble stuff, and that's what India used to do without much value addition. So I think the whole focus on value addition is very very important, and you can see that happening in India in the last 5 to 6 years.
I want to talk finally just a little bit about what the drone industry sort of represents, which is a larger change, I think, that's happening in India's defense ecosystem. There were a lot of policy reforms that were brought in last year as part of like the Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign and things like that. And now you see India focusing on exports also, and the most recent is the BrahMos sale to Philippines. So, what is your opinion of this, the new approach that the government has taken to foster domestic industry? And do you see this succeeding, or what are some of the challenges that the government will likely face?
Like, yeah, and one simple answer to that is Rome was not built in a day. So uh, I think much larger problem was the attitude. So it's like a chicken egg problem. You don't produce, but you also don't buy. So what needs to be done in this case? Then you are in a vicious cycle. So you're not able to produce. The producers would say that we are not able to produce because there is no buyer. The buyer would say that we are not able to buy because the producers do are not up to the job. And that's what the Indian defense industry was caught up, this vicious cycle for almost 50, 60 years. I think much of it had to do with the larger management. Particularly you need the armed forces to buy local stuff, and you also need the local suppliers to to produce what is needed and to the quality of what is required by the armed forces. Now there's always a compromise, and you see the Tejas, the fighter aircraft, as an example of that. Because technology is a process. The Tejas fighter aircraft was conceived in mid 1980s. It has taken us so much of time, but at least we have a product now. And there can be more modifications, ramification, more modifications in that, and that's what you see with LCA Mark II and all that. So you have to, in some sense, uh, all of this has to come from the top, because organizations actually go after their own interests. The producers went after their interests. The users went after their interests, and we were caught in a vicious cycle, where whatever we were producing was not up to the mark, and therefore the buyers would always like to go abroad. So much of the change in and this change has come from the top, in terms of what you can see, the defense ministry coming down hard on both the scientific R&D institutions as well as the military, to interact more, to buy locally, but also produce stuff which is good in quality. So restructuring of the ordnance boards, the white elephants of Indian defense industry, was a major step, so to say. and these indigenization efforts, and that goes on with the larger defense reforms which have also come from the top, particularly with the appointment of the chief of defense staff, maybe theater commands tomorrow. So much of the reform which is happening in Indian defense industry is actually happening from the top, and that's how it has happened all over the world. The organizations never want to reform because the bureaucracies, their first job is to perpetuate themselves. So I think it's a welcome reform in a sense, which you can see both in the management of higher defense management, but also in terms of procurement, in terms of defense R&D. uh, you know, uh, mm, for the defense ministry to come with a list of equipment which the Indian military can't buy from abroad and which needs to be built locally is a major significant step. Because until and unless the forces are are forced to buy locally, the problem there was, it is a twofold problem. Because if the user is allowed to buy uh, from foreign sources, it doesn't even have a stake in seeing that the local production is up to the mark. They were not invested in a defense production, so to say. But once you are invested, then you are basically going to ensure as a user that the quality of products is met according to your requirements, and that is the interaction we were missing for a long period of time in Indian defense industry, and that I think is actually happening. All the three wings, the Army, Air Force, and the Navy. The Navy was always very much, from the very beginning, uh, invested in indigenization. From the Leander frigates they built in 1960s. But the Army and the Air Force, there is a significant change I can see in the disposition of the Indian military when it comes to buying locally. And that will, over a period of time, help in greater indigenization. And BrahMos is a major, major step in that sense. India is looking forward to selling the same to Vietnam, selling Tejas to Malaysia for that matter. So India, so more the exports are, then you are basically into the into the cycle of competition world over. And that creates efficiency. Competition creates efficiency. The problem was that there was no competition um, within, because of the monopoly of the public defense sector. But as well as there was no competition outside because the Indians were not selling anywhere. So I think, this larger change in the indigenous defense sector, where you're not only competing within, but you're also competing outside, is going to provide much more efficiency to India's indigenous defense production.
Thank you, Yogesh, for sharing your insights and giving us a very comprehensive picture on this subject. So, thank you for joining us again. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To know more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get the latest updates on our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram.